Namaste and a very good morning. We are here online at Sahitya Akademi's Symposium titled The Multicultural Studies in Indian Writing in English, a review. Professor Anisur Rahman ji will inaugurate it with his address, and keynote address will be delivered by Professor Abhishek Baroi. At the outset, while welcoming you all again, I request Professor Anisur Rahman to inaugurate with his address. Professor Anisur Rahman is a noted bilingual poet in English and Urdu, translator, and literary critic. He has to his credit 15 published books, including edited and translated works. Some of his recent books include Ardunware, 60 poems, in translation, Positions and Paradigms, and Hazar Rang Shairi, the wonderful world of the Urdu Nazm. A recipient of Translation Award from Delhi Urdu Akademi, Professor Rahman has been a Shastri Fellow at the University of Alberta, Canada, and a visiting scholar at Purdue University, the United States of America. He was professor of English at Jamia Millia Islamia University, New Delhi. Currently, he is a member of English Advisory Board of Sahitya Akademi. I heartily welcome Professor Anisur Rahman ji and request him to deliver his address and inaugurate the symposium.
Thank you, Mr. Kim Mahone. Good morning to each and everyone here who is present. I can see lots of colleagues who have been together on several occasions. You are welcome to this symposium that we are going to have right now on a topic which is very interesting in the sense that we have covered about 150 years, more than 150 years of Indian writing in English. And we are here to look at the critical reception of Indian writing in English and the contemporary trends that are there. But more importantly, to look at the whole idea of how it has progressed and how it has gone forward with respect to multicultural studies. The Sahitya Academy has very clearly laid out the map for us in the sense that we are going to talk of the multicultural ways of looking at the growth and development of Indian writing in English. We have had a huge number of conferences that were organized at different platforms, nationally, internationally, where we talked of Indian writing in English. But broadly speaking, we have engaged with some of the trends that are there right now and some that were there earlier and how they impacted the modern writing. But looking at the entire scenario, it appears to me that if you look at this scenario in greater detail, we'll have to divide and see how this Indian writing in English has been broadly looked at, especially the literature that was written before 1950 or 1947, that is before independence, and that was written after 1947 or 1950, that is after independence. Both ways you will have a historical perspective to look at it, and the multicultural studies that have taken place during all these 5-6 decades, last 5 decades, I mean, or 6 decades, I mean, the role of the journals and the ways of looking at it. So there are lots of things that we have before us in our mind. The field is laid out clean and clear, and there are lots of critics who are engaging with. Most of these critics who engage with Indian writing in English are academics in the universities, and the researchers, of course, they're there. Earlier, if I look at how it all progressed during the 70s, when we all started looking at Indian writing in English, there was some doubt, and all the universities where the canonical authors were being taught around the 70s or so, even before that, people looked at Indian writing in English with some doubt and some despair as well. They were not very sure if Indians could write in English, and if at all there was a way of talking about it, historically or culturally, or with respect to the theories that were available to us, and how far they were useful in reading Indian writing in English, both the prose as well as poetry. In prose, we had several genres that were coming up and they were making their place very clearly, especially after the publication of The Midnight Children, late 70s. And similarly with Vikram Seth and several others who came on the scene. If you look back, and you will see that even in the foreign universities, American and British universities and in European universities, in Indian writing in English, only the canonical authors who were not essentially writing in English were taught, but they were all passed in the broader category of Indian writing, in which contain translations as well. But if you look at the curriculum today, it has changed vastly. Lots of things are happening now, and we are looking at the current writers, new writers, the contemporary trends. So it has made way everywhere. Even in the foreign universities, you have authors being taught who are writing today. So what I try to emphasize is this: that the something that was a kind of a despair in the beginning, that is around the 70s, has turned into some kind of a confidence now. So we are here to discuss. Lots of our colleagues are here and who have been working in this area. I understand they will look at it in this perspective. And for example, we have this inaugural address by Professor Paroi, and then we have Ajanta Paul and Amit Shankar Saha and Abhishek and Shrilata and Shormista and Anita and Gopal ji and Jaydeep Sharangi and Salim Nalin. So looking at the larger perspective, we have several speakers here who are into it, who have been writing into it. Some of them are very important practitioners as well, poets, and they can probably develop a larger view of how we are and how we can look at Indian writing in English in a multicultural manner. I would not like to take lots of time here because it's important for us to hear to Professor Paroi, who is going to deliver the keynote address, and to see how he lays out the route for us, the path for us, so that we can proceed further from there. Thank you. Kumahoneji, you can proceed further. Yes, please.
Many thanks, dear sir, for such a brief and brilliant address. The inaugural part, the symposium is divided into two sessions. First, which will follow as soon as the inaugural ends, is titled Critical Reception and Theoretical Approaches of Indian Writing in English. And the second, Contemporary Issues and Emerging Trends in Indian Writing in English. Professor Anisur Rahman will chair the first session, and the second one will be chaired by Shormistha Panja. Now I invite Professor Abhishek Paroiji to deliver keynote address. Abhishek ji is Associate Professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Studies, IIT Madras, and Associate Fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He is the Faculty Coordinator at the Center of Memory Studies, IITM, and the founding chairperson of the Indian Network for Memory Studies. He was awarded the prestigious Meenakshi Mukherjee Prize in 2019 by the Indian Association of Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. He is the recipient of the Global Fellowship 2023 from the University of St. Andrews and the Institute of Advanced Study Fellowship 2024 from the University of Durham. He is the author of Postmodern Literatures and Culture and the Literary Matter, Metaphor, and Memory, and the co-editor of Memory Studies in India, Texts and Contexts. I heartily invite Professor Abhishek Paroiji to deliver keynote address.
Thank you very much, Krishnaji, for the very kind introduction. Thank you, Professor Rahman, for the really brilliant and very succinct and precise and poignant introductory address. I hope I'm audible to everyone. I'm speaking from a position where the internet is a little bit unstable. So if you can't hear me, please let me know. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here amongst such illustrious colleagues, Professor Srilata, Professor Paul, Professor Narina, Professor Lahiri, Professor Sarangi, Professor Saha. So I will talk a little bit about, I'm particularly interested in the idea of multiculturalism, and I congratulate the Sahitya Academy for conceptualizing it so brilliantly, because I think when you talk about culture in India, we talk about multiculturalism by default, right? Because India is a complex country, as you all know, and any engagement with culture is by default an engagement with multiculturalism. And I think the Indian writing in English, as Professor Rahman pointed out brilliantly, I think, has really inflected through different interfaces, the different nodal points through which the journey has happened, and from different cultural positions and different focal positions. One can go back to the earliest writings of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Rajmohan's wife, where the whole idea of basically just imitating a very Victorian mode of writing and transplanting that in rural Bengal was the first step in that direction. And then, of course, one can travel down to the experimental techniques of magic realism and different forms of realism, really, but late 70s and early 80s, the Salman Rushdie moment, the Midnight Children moment in Indian writing in English. And then, of course, one can see some kind of a journey back to realism, as it were, with Anrita Desai, Kiran Desai, and more contemporary writers. In the early 20th century, we have the R.K. Narayans and the Raja Rauts, who are again experimenting, and that is a really interesting phase because it is very complexly multicultural, but at the same time very multi-nodal as well, very multifocal as well. So allow me now to use a few terms that we use in memory studies in terms of seeing how that can connect to some of the ways in which one can do a diachronic study, really, of writing in English. Because it's actually a work in progress. It's a magnificent engine that has traveled and is traveling and is picking up. We have this term in memory studies called plasticity, which is used in terms of how memory operates, the neural plasticity, plastic way. And the understanding is the more plastic the brain is, the more the memory will travel, the more absorption and retrieval, the three sequences to which memory travels, operates through plasticity. But the other interesting thing is we seem to have some kind of what I call postmodern neuroscience, which tells us that the real deal, the real way in which memory operates is not through neurons, but rather the space between neurons, the synapses, right? So there's a synaptic bits between the neurons where information travels. And I would like to take the metaphor of the synapse and use it in a way, and one can look at the diachronic understanding of Indian writing in English. The synaptic way in which this particular genre of literature has traveled, this really rich genre of literature has traveled. And again, I go back to my earlier contention and say that any engagement with culture in India is an engagement with multicultural by default, because we're looking at a very polyphonic understanding of culture, a very heteroglossic, sort of Bakhtinian terms one can use, understanding of culture, which is multicultural by default. Now, what is interesting, particularly in writing in English, and this is why I think one needs to make a distinction between, let's say, American English and Indian English. Of course, there are complexities in American English and Irish English. One can talk about that as well. But there is that idea of language, the many languages coming in, which are inflecting the English register, as it were. And we're not just talking about the sort of the loot, bazaar, that kind of a superficial transmission. Of course, we know that, how Indian words have entered the English vocabulary and so on and so forth. But we are looking at the sentimental slippages through which one linguistic register is inflecting and infecting other linguistic registers. And I use the word infecting quite consciously because I think language is a function of infection in a certain sense. Language is a function, the more mobile a language, the more it'll get infected and the more it'll infect the infectious quality of language. Again, we talk about the sort of the contagion in memory studies, how memory travels through contagion, through infection, etc. And it's not a coincidence that in a postmodern so information technology metaphor, the word viral has been demedicalized entirely and has become an information metaphor. When something goes viral, we talk about how the information is traveling. But it's interesting how, in this way, it is the sentimental slippages that have sort of taken place to very synaptic transmission. I'll just give one very interesting example. So in Rajmohan's Wife, for example, there's this very interesting scene where two women from very rural Bengal are talking to each other and one of them is asking the other person to sort of go away in a very sort of cursed kind of a way, that, I'm cursing you and go away. And interestingly, the metaphor, the phrase used is go to right. Now,
There's some disruption with your audio. Please check that.
Excuse me, Abhishek ji,
yeah.
can you hear me? Sorry to interrupt, but there seems to be some network issue.
Okay. I can indeed.
It's okay now. You can maybe start again.
Is it
You're on.
better now? Can
Yeah,
you
yeah,
hear
it's
me?
better. It's better. It's better. Please carry on.
Is it better now?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Please
Can you
carry
hear
on.
me now?
Yeah.
I suspect it's a bandwidth issue.
No, network bandwidth is low. Abhishek ji,
Yes, you are audible now. You can carry on now.
And how the slippages take place, not just through the superficial register of one word replacing another word, but in a more synaptic way, in a more liminal way. And I think liminality has been a very key ingredient in Indian writing in English. The way the liminal transference from English to different Indian languages have taken place, not just at a semantic level, but at a sentimental level. Because at the end of the day, I think if one wants to do a diachronic study of multiculturalism in Indian writing in English, one must look at the sentimental function of English in terms of how it is absorbed in a very plastic way, the different sentimental registers in different Indian languages. And of course, by the time we come to Rushdie, and I just use example from Rajmohan's wife, go to Jericho, for example, which would be a very Bengali way. The Bengali equivalent would be Jomalai Jao, as in go to hell. But of course, you can see how the same sentiment is encoded using another sort of linguistic register, which is very Judeo-Christian in quality. Because there's a religious transference, but at the same time, the sentiment seeps in. And I think that this is a bit of an understudied research, really. There's a lot of research.
Yet again, some problem, network issue.
How language has traveled, in terms of how the diachronic evolution of language has happened, sort of pre-Rushdie, post-Rushdie. But I think if one wants to do a really interesting cognitive narratology study of Indian writing in English.
Oh, again, you're not audible, Abhishek ji.
Talking about cognition and language. I think the sentimental slippages, the synaptic slippages, the space between neurons, the space between language. Is it okay now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah. You're audible now.
Hi, am I audible now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I'll just wind up now because I'm very guilty of disturbing this session now. But I just want to end on that note that if one wants to study the diachronic journey of Indian writing in English, particularly through a polyphonic point of view, through a multicultural point of view, I think the sentimental function of that distinction, that any sentimental study of Indian writing in English in terms of how the emotions are seeped in through different linguistic registers, transmissions, the liminality of the language in terms of having a more nuanced understanding of this really rich genre of literature. So with that, I end, and I thank the Sahitya Academy again for inviting me for this particular session. I look forward to reflections subsequent. Thank you very much, and apologize for the confusion in my network.
Thanks a lot, Abhishek-ji. I heartily thank Professor Anisur Rahman-ji for inaugural address and Professor Abhishek Paroi-ji for the keynote address. We will begin the first session, Critical Reception and Theoretical Approaches of Indian Writing in English. This will, as I said earlier, will be chaired by Professor Anisur Rahman and Dr. Ajanta Paul, Dr. Amit Shankar Saha, Dr. Abhishek Paroi-ji and K. Srilata-ji will speak in this session. I will briefly introduce all the participants first and then hand the session over to Professor Anisur Rahman, the chair. Dr. Ajanta Paul is a widely published poet, short story writer, and literary critic. She is currently principal at Women's Christian College, Kolkata, India. A Pushcart nominee, Ajanta has been published in literary journals including Spadina Literary Review, the Pangolin Review, of course, the Statesman, the Bombay Review, the Wild World, Verse Virtual, Setu, Kitab, the Punch magazine, the Critical Flame, and Kavya Bharati, etc. International Journal of Multicultural Literature, Writers, Editors, Critic, the Chakkar and Lothlorien Poetry Journal. I welcome Dr. Ajanta Paul. Dr. Amit Shankar Sahaji, our second speaker, is the author of 4 collections of poems, Balconies of Time, Fugitive Words, Illicit Poems, and Itasian Baramasi. He has co-edited a collection of short stories, Dynamic Zois, published an essay collection, a portrait of the artist as a young essayist, and an academic book, Transitions, Indian Diaspora, and 4 Women Writers. He is the editor-in-chief of EKL Review. He has a PhD in English from Calcutta University and is an associate professor and the head of the Department of English at CCOM Skills University, Bolpur. A poet, fiction writer, translator, and academic, K. Srilataji's most recent collection of poems, Three Women in a Single Room House, was published by Sahitya Akademi. Her book of poems, based on the Mahabharata, is forthcoming from Westland. Srilataji's poems have been widely anthologized and featured in collections such as the Bloodaxe Book of Contemporary Indian Poets and the Penguin Book of Indian Poets. Her book, This Kind of Child, The Disability Story, is a book about the disability experience. Srilataji's books include 5 collections of poetry, the anthologies, the Rapids of a Great River, the Penguin Book of Tamil Poetry, and short fiction from South India, among others. Srilataji's novel, Table for Four, was longlisted in 2009 for the Man Asian Literary Prize. Formerly a professor of literature at IIT Madras, Srilataji is currently adjunct professor at the Chennai Mathematical Institute. I welcome Srilataji, Dr. Amit Shankar Sahaji, and Dr. Ajanta Paul. I hand it over now to the chair, Professor Anisur Rahman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kimbahone. We begin the first session of this meet now. And we have 4 speakers here and we have an hour plus, which means that let's take around 12, 13 minutes each one of us. And at the end of it, if there is time, I'll be able to make some observations. So let's go by what is laid out. That is, first I would like to invite Ajanta Paul, Professor Ajanta Paul, to make her presentation and give us the title so that we can carry forward the discussion when it comes to Professor Ajanta Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. And I hope I'm audible.
Yes,
you are.
yes.
Am I
Yes, you
now?
are. Yes.
So I thank Sahitya Akademi for giving me this wonderful opportunity. It is indeed an honor for me to be present here in this august company. And I thank Dr. Rahman for his chairman's address and Dr. Abhishek Parui for his address, for his inaugural address. Both were brilliant. Thank you. So I shall be discussing briefly within my allotted time the significance of Indian writing in English in a multicultural milieu and the theoretical approaches adopted thereunto. To begin with, what is Indian writing in English? It is essentially literature written originally in English by authors who are Indian by birth, ancestry, or nationality. Composed in English, expressing for the most part an Indian sensibility, set against a regional background and catering to a global readership. This hybrid utterance is rife with ambivalences. This growing body of literature, itself a part of the larger subcontinental narrative of self, nation, and the world, necessarily encompasses a multiplicity of ongoing discourses, such as historical and political processes, sociological engagement, cultural production, and economic empowerment. We have noticed that there is a problem of nomenclature attending this body of writing. For example, what are we to call it? Could we call it Indian writing in English, Indo-Anglian literature, or Indian English literature? So there are these different labels which are affixed to it. Whatever it may be, it is distinct from literature written on Indian themes by Europeans, as in E.M. Foster, Rudyard Kipling, M.M.K., and others. If there is a problem of naming, there is also a problem of placing. For example, where exactly do we slot Ananda K. Kumaraswamy, who was born of a Sri Lankan father and an English mother, and was neither an Indian citizen nor did he live in India. Yet, the cultural orientation of his birth is unmistakably Indian. On the other hand, V.S. Naipaul, whose ancestry is undeniably Indian, may hardly be classified as an Indian writer in English, belonging as he does to the canon of West Indian writing in English. So, just take some. The modern Indian writer practices her art in an ethnically diverse, multilingual, polyphonous, often contentious colloquium of creative accents. The linguistic anxieties inherent in a polyglot, class-stratified, post-colonial context, which attaches value to the different languages in use, according to the social condition of its calibrated categories, is well brought out in Kamala Das' poem, Introduction. The 2 lines which are my personal favorite are, quote, I speak 3 languages, write in 2, dream in 1, unquote, invariably appear to me as a miniature manifesto of subcontinental linguistic and literary practice, at least among those privileged enough to have received a reasonably good education. The Indian writer in English, like Das's speaker, informs the reader about her facility with languages. She refers to her oral proficiency in 3, namely Malayalam, English, and Hindi, her writerly activity in 2, namely Malayalam and English, and her propensity to dream in the universal language of the human subconscious. Das fluently incorporates the dramatic accent of direct speech in the lines. Don't write in English, I quote. They said, English is not your mother tongue. The division between the inherited and the acquired language and the favoring of the mother tongue over the foreign one for creative expression appears to be an established bias in the mindset of the Indian literati. And the speaker's angry retort in the poem as to why she should not be left alone and be allowed to speak in any language she likes is directed at, I quote, critics friends visiting cousins, unquote. People who try to rob her of her creative volition and linguistic liberty, foisting on her instead stereotypical notions of the preferred medium. The question posed by the speaker, why not let me speak in any language I like, is a direct challenge thrown to her personal detractors. It is at the same time a plea for the writer's fundamental freedom to be allowed to exercise her choice of linguistic medium vis-a-vis her literary expression. The language, as Das sees it, no longer remains a neutral medium of communication, but is appropriated, owned, and used by the speaker, who leaves a personal stamp on it. She claims she possesses it, declaring, I quote, the language I speak becomes mine, its distortions, its queernesses, all mine, mine alone, unquote. And in this regard, one is reminded of Homi K. Bhabha's use of the term hybrid for the mixed language of newly freed nations, and of the fact that Bhabha supports this hybrid as a means of expression for the oppressed. Interestingly, the speaker in Das's poem is proud of her racial identity and does not feel the need to conform to the Queen's English or the BBC variety, but is content to use her version of the same, however flawed. It is a classic instance of the colonies writing back in a spontaneous and confident to self-conscious mode of literary expression. In a sense, Das echoes and corroborates what Raja Rao had astutely expressed in his note to Kantapura. I quote, we cannot write like the English. We should not. We cannot write only as Indians. We have to look at the larger world as part of us. Unquote, reminding one of the Indians' need to write in their authentic voices, as also to absorb the larger current in the literary cosmos, to remain true to the dualities that constitute the core of their post-colonial identity. Therefore, I feel that Indian writing in English is Indian in sensibility, English in grammatical construction, and somewhere in between in idiomatic expression. Now, I come to the theoretical approaches. Very briefly, I can discuss them. And one of the main theoretical approaches to Indian writing in English would most definitely be the post-colonial framework, shared by so many of its practitioners in their respective work. Amitabh Ghosh's The Shadow Lines deals with the search for identity, the need for independence, and the problematized relationship between the colonized and the colonizer, all of which you will agree are post-colonial concerns. The post-colonial notions of double consciousness, hybridity, essentialism, othering, ambivalence, worldling, and diaspora are found in different measure in the works of Anita Desai, Salman Rushdie, Amitabh Ghosh, and Arundhati Roy, to name just a few. Then we can also apply the diasporic lens to this body of writings, as several of the writers lived outside India, and they moved back and forth either actually or in their memories, creating a dialectic of distance and displacement that was intimately connected to their sense of identity and agency. So alienation, ambivalence, and deracination, integral components of the diasporic experience, become some of the theoretical strategies through which they negotiated the space between and beyond the boundaries of nation and self. Salman Rushdie, Amitabh Ghosh, Bharati Mukherjee, Kiran Desai, and Jhumpa Lahiri are some of those writers in whose works the complex nostalgia of Benedict Anderson's imagined communities is seen to be at work. Modernism is another critical apparatus with its machinery of irony, ambiguity, verbal economy, paradox, self-reflexivity, mirroring, intertextuality, the mythical method, non-linear progression of action, and free indirect discourse. And this is evident in the works of Rushdie, Ghosh, and Roy. And in fact, Rushdie extends it into the mode of magic realism with its fascinating expansion of credibility. And developing as a reaction to modernism and applicable to Indian writing in English is postmodernism, which mandates that there is not one, but several overlapping, parallel, successive, and superseding stories in a particular work. And this is true of the modern Indian novel. Postmodern writers manipulate space, place, communities, and ethnicities to demonstrate the power of what Edward Said described as, I quote, overlapping territories, intertwined histories, unquote. in their rejection of absolute unilateral and hegemonic inferences and a grand narrative, a unified narrative voice, and a single epistemological structure and imitating the whole. Roy's God of Small Things and Ghosh's The Shadow Lines stand out as excellent examples. While feminist tropes may be found in Indian writing in English in general, there is no consistent or overarching system of ideological thought specific to the culture and nuances inherent in it. One finds a strong critique of patriarchy and its related socioeconomic structures in the works of Anita Desai, Shashi Deshpande, Nayanthara Sahgal, Kamala Markandaya, Kamala Das, later Suraya, and Arundhati Roy, among others. In her novel Voices in the City, Desai deals with some of the pressing problems faced by women. In Nectar in a Sieve, Markandaya shows the exploitation and commodification of women, even as Kamala Das speaks of the weight of womb and breasts, crushing her with their exclusively biological implications. The Marxist approach, I should just take a couple of more minutes. The Marxist approach is another theoretical stratagem whereby the canon in question may be understood. Mulkraj Anand's novels, particularly Coolie and Untouchable, are anguished interrogations of a class stratified and hierarchical society which exploits and oppresses the downtrodden in inhuman ways. Viewed from this ideological perspective, Anand's novels are Marxist analysis of caste and class bias, the means of production, exploitation of the masses, and the aggrandizement of capital by a select minority. Amitabh Ghosh's eco-Marxism, as seen in The Cycle of Reason, The Glass Palace, and The Hungry Tide, brought about by migration, displacement, political upheaval, and social change, is a critical tool to examine his fiction. Thus, while the reception of Indian writing in English is varied across the multicultural context of Indian society, the theoretical approaches to an understanding of its meaning, too, are similarly rich and varied to be able to decipher the complex nature of the reality underserved. And therein ends my paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Kimbahone, can we invite the next speaker now? Hello, Mr. Kimbahone, can we invite the next speaker now? Amit Shankar Saha?
Amit Shankar Sahaji.
Yes, please. So we shall have a little discussion after this because Professor Ajanta has covered a huge ground, starting from the linguistic to conventional multicultural ways of reading texts that we have had all these years. So let's keep it for the later part of the session. That is when we come to the end. So let's first listen to our speakers, and I invite Professor Amit Shankar Saha to make her presentation.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Good morning, and my respect to the dignitaries assembled here. It is a privilege for me to speak in this online symposium on multicultural studies in Indian writing in English. I thank Sahitya Akademi for the invitation and making it possible for me to speak in this session on critical reception and theoretical approaches of Indian writing in English. A very good introduction has already been given by Ajanta ma'am. Indian writing in English has evolved over time, and so has its critical reception. Thereby, it has gained recognition both within India as well as internationally. Indian writing in English has elicited discussions on language, identity, colonial legacy, cultural representation, as well as contested areas of metropolitan validation versus indigenous authenticity, the national versus the global, the hegemonic versus the subaltern. If we start from pre-independence India, and I am not going too far back, we have the trio of Mulkraj Anand, R.K. Narayan, and Rajarao. These writers received critical acclaim for depicting Indian society, but were sometimes accused of writing for a colonial or Western audience. colonial criticism also brought their works into the reductionist framework as ethnographic artifacts or exotic narratives. One reason why these writers were accused of writing for the West may have been due to the fact that they spent a substantial part of their lives in the West. Moreover, some critics perceived that the use of colonial language like English was a symbol of subjugation, despite Raja Rao's advocacy of nativized English in his preface to Kanthapura. In this regard, I will bring into focus two other novelists, Bhavani Bhattacharya and G.V. Desani. Both of them were born around the same time as Anand, Narayan, and Rao, but the publications came out after independence. Especially Desani's novel, All About H. Hatter, is a sort of postmodernist narrative in the tradition of Cervantes, Lawrence Sterne, James Joyce, as acknowledged by Salman Rushdie. It defies the language critics. Indian writers have adopted and adapted the English language to express local sensibilities, making it uniquely Indian through regional idioms and multilingual nuances. This becomes very much evident when, in the post-independence era, the trio of Anand, Narayan, and Rao are joined by the likes of Anita Desai, Kamala Markandeya, and many others. And then there were the poets, Nissim Ezekiel, Dom Morris, A.K. Ramanujan. These poets also spent a large part of their lives in the West, and hence were also accused of speaking in an alien tongue. More so because poetry is supposed to be the language of the soul. But despite this disjoint of English from Indian literary traditions, the fact of that they were skillfully using the English language, these Indian writers, were much appreciated. In the post-independence era, new themes emerged like post-colonialism, independence, tradition versus modernity, colonial history, cultural diversity. And with the advent of post-colonial theory and theorists like Edward Said and Homi Bhabha, questions of authenticity, reclaiming identities, multiculturalism, hybridization, all came into the fore. Critics like Aijaz Ahmed and Meenakshi Mukherjee, though, have questioned the authors who write in colonial languages, arguing that it alienates them from local readership and privileges Western critical frameworks over vernacular traditions. They have pointed out the hegemony of English as the privileged language of representation. On the other hand, contesting critics like Ashish Nandi and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, they argue that while English as a language is a colonial construct, its use can also provide Indian writers a global platform to express subaltern voices and challenge colonial narratives. This is what we know as the phenomenon of the empires writing back. And allied with these There are techniques like code switching, linguistic subversion, chutnification, magic realism, narrative play, all these challenging the boundaries of English as a colonial language and celebrating hybridity as a site of resistance and negotiation. With the emergence of writers like Salman Rushdie, Alan Seeley, Vikram Seth, Amitabh Ghosh, Arundhati Roy, Bharati Mukherjee, Rohinton Mistry, Jhumpa Lahiri, issues of power, agency, cultural imperialism, marginalization, subalternity, communalism, globalization, feminism, intersectionality in terms of caste, class, gender, diasporic experience, queer experience, ecology, bioregionalism, cultural memory, and so many other theoretical approaches emerged. In the domain of poetry also, we have Kamala Das, Jayanta Mahapatra, Arun Kolatkar, Mamang Dai, Arundhati Subramaniam, Keki Daruwala, Meena Alexander, Vijay Sheshadri. They all, in their work, we find the rejection of essentialization of Indian cultural experience. And not to forget the dramatist, Mahesh Dattani. All these writers, through their intertextuality and self-reflexivity, gave the critics and the theorists scope to expand their explorations and help Indian writing in English become a dynamic and inclusive literary space. But despite all these, I will still argue that the categorization of Indian writing in English under this very rubric is a limiting space, which comes in the way of mainstreaming of criticism of the works that populate this category. For example, critics will shy away from reading Mrs. Musical's poem Goodbye Party for Miss Pushpa T.S. as a dramatic monologue and limit themselves to the aspects of language in the poem. For example, how many critics will consider the alienation and rootlessness of Gogol Ganguly in Jhumpa Lahiri's novel, The Namesake, in terms of existential aspects without limiting themselves to the diasporic context? Here, I am not calling back grand narratives of universal humanism and advocating a homogenization. But all I am asking is that the grand narratives should be infiltrated, cautiously appropriated, and not kept sacrosanct for the canon of the West. Why don't our Salim Shinais straddle the length and breadth of English literature like Leopold Bloom's do? It is because of this failure of criticism. I may as well raise a polemic and say it is a conspiracy of the West to protect their knowledge system. Through this process of infiltration, Indian writing in English can enter the mainstream of the canon of English literature without losing its cultural identity. On the other hand, Indian writing in English can also enter the mainstream of the canon of Indian literature if critics apply indigenous theories to these English language texts without any mental block against the language. I mean, why don't we read Indian writing in English, say in terms of rasa theory, or place Indian writing in English in the Indian Baramasa literary tradition? There will be resistance, no doubt. I will give you an example. My fellow academician, Dr. Basudhara Roy, once used the trope of Papi Bichua to explore Indian women's desires in Nissim Ezekiel's poem, The Night of the Scorpion. And she received criticism from unexpected quarters. So, it is when these two streams of criticism will intersect that we can say that the theorization of Indian writing in English has come of age. It is then that Indian writing in English will break its limiting categorization and become a part of the canon of English literature and the canon of Indian literature, both. It is then that Indian writing in English will not only represent the plural realities of India and the world, but also become symbol of that plurality itself. And I hope that time is not far. And one reason for my hope is this very symposium on multicultural studies in Indian writing in English. Here I rest my case. Thank you very much. Over to the chair. Thank you.
Okay, you have finished. Okay. I was just waiting for that. Thank you, Amit. You have raised a number of points that need further discussion. And unfortunately, in all symposiums and seminars, we are always short of time. But the points that you have raised need discussion, and we'll come to that towards the end if we have time for that. Now we have another speaker, Professor Paroi, who gave the keynote, but I hope he will be in a position to speak to us and without any interruption this time so that we can listen to you properly and then we can respond to that. Professor Paroi.
Thank you very much, sir. I hope I'm more audible and more visible now. I have strategically shifted to a place in the hope of getting a better network. Am I audible and visible? Can you hear me? Right. Okay. So I start. Thank you very much for the really interesting observations, Professor Paul and Professor Saha. And I think this particular session, or the sub-session, shall we say, where we're looking at the theoretical possibilities of new readings of Indian writing in English is really poignant and fantastic. And I will just offer three theoretical frameworks, which will hopefully resonate with what Professor Paul and Professor Saha said. The first is the affect studies network, in terms of how looking at Indian writing in English through the affect studies network, a study of how affect moves through complex topographies of culture. And let me stick to this for a minute before I move on to the second frame. So when we look at affect, and particularly when we use a theorist like Sara Ahmed, she talks about contagion, how affect is something which moves, as well as moves the subject, as well as moves across subjects. So when you look at affect, there is the verticality about affect in terms of how the subject is moved, and we have literary representations such as stream of consciousness, etc., where the whole cognitive quality of affect can be depicted, but also affect as a trope of mobilization. Let's say how a mob is mobilized, how a crowd is mobilized, how affect moves across networks. The very Salman Rushdie use of affect through crowds, through interfaces, through riots, and so on and so forth. And I think particularly in a complex country like India, which is so heteroglossic, so polyphonic, so many voices by default are available, I think affect studies is a particularly useful and fertile field to look at. And one can go right back to Bankim, again, starting with the whole idea of what I said, sentimental slippages or the synaptic slippages through which, it's almost smuggled in. Sentiments are smuggled in through linguistic registers. So I think that particular framework is really useful. And I say this with some degree of hope, because I was at a session recently in Hyderabad University where they have this really interesting project called IWE Online, where they are really compiling digitally the different literary representations in Indian writing in English. And I talked about the absence of the Partition Museum for the longest time. And as you all know, that there was no Partition Museum. And it was only very recently, in 2011 or 2012, that a museum came into being, the museum materialized. So how was the partition remembered? How was the partition remembered without a bricks and mortar museum? And my network was its some other interface. Okay, I hope I'm audible now. So I made the case that a partition was remembered through literature, through Indian writing in English, through different forms of literary representation. In other words, literature was a museum. The stories were the museum. The literary representations were the museum through which the violence of partition, the catastrophe, the event of partition was metaphorized. And again, for generations like ourselves, for example, when we grew up, when we were born, many decades after the partition, how could we revisit that event? How could we revisit the trauma? It was only through different forms of representation, how affect can be encoded, how emotions can be encoded using a very interfacial linguistic register. And as we know, as both Professor Paul and Professor Saha pointed out, the Indian writing in English, the very diachronic movement of the language is interesting because that tells you how the language changes, how the modes of memory change. So in other words, we're looking at the relationship between affect and materiality. And I think Indian writing in English is particularly uniquely positioned to offer a really fantastic study of how affect studies can be used and mapped into literary studies. And I just finished editing a special issue for the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing. And the title of the issue was Memory, Materiality, and Forgetting in South Asian Diaspora, where I made the contention that particularly in a country like India, that's how we conceive the issue. We must look at remembering and forgetting as connected categories, right? We must look at remembering and forgetting not as ontological opposites, but as connected categories, cognitively connected, functionally connected. In other words, particularly in a complex country like India, every time there's a commemoration, there's also oblivion, right? Some things are forgotten every time something is remembered, right? So every act of commemoration is also simultaneously an act of oblivion in a certain sense. And how Indian writing in English is uniquely able to capture and calibrate this liminal landscape between remembering and forgetting through a very useful study of affect and how affect can be encoded using this very diachronic device which is Indian writing in English, and how a very superficial study in terms of how language has changed from the time of Bankim through Raja Rao to Salman Rushdie, right down to Jhumpa Lahiri, can give us how the whole idea of encoding has traveled through this very complex linguistic register. So that's the first theoretical framework that I propose. The second framework, of course, allied to the first, as you may have guessed by now, is a memory studies framework in terms of how looking at, again, the very interesting country, the very heterogeneous country like us, where not only are remembering and forgetting connected, but also something like nostalgia is actually quite futuristic in quality, right? If you look at a country like India, the whole way in which nostalgia operates in India, how the whole idea of looking back at an idyllic past, at a romantic past, a romantic reification of the past, you find that it's actually quite futuristic in quality. It's quite aspirational in quality. So there's very deeply aspirational quality about nostalgia. And I think Indian writing in English is uniquely able to calibrate and capture that, particularly when you look at, I'm very glad Professor Saha mentioned the Dasani novel, the All About H. Hatter novel. If you look at that novel in particular, there are these linguistic slippages which are quite futuristic in quality, right? So he's actually writing in a language which hasn't happened yet. So I think that novel is particularly interesting, and I think it's a bit understudied as well, because I think what Dasani is trying to do is trying to create a linguistic artifact which is very forward-looking, which is already ahead, instead of what we call avant-garde in a European tradition, but it's more complex than that. So I think the whole idea of looking at memory in a very deconstructive framework, a very ambivalent framework, when we're looking at remembering and forgetting as connected, when we're looking at retrospection and anticipation as connected, when we're looking at nostalgia and future orientation as connected, can be a very useful tool through which we look at Indian writing in English. Even the short fiction of Jhumpa Lahiri, for that matter, I think is a really fertile field to look at, which allows me to come into my third and final theoretical framework, which is a framework of thing theory, right? How does one study things? And this is why I think one can really bring in technology, materiality, and literature as a really interesting amalgam or a triangulation, as it were. Particularly in a country like India, where technology changes so quickly and technology becomes so ubiquitous and so forgotten so very quickly. When I was just sitting in a room in a very old house in Kolkata, where I just found myself sitting near to a transistor, which no one uses anymore, right? And which is why the bandwidth was so poor in that room. So I had to come to a more modern room here. But looking at a transistor, looking at something like, even a newspaper for the matter, a radio for the matter, which is already a forgotten thing in a very interesting way. And how does that forgotten thing still continue to enter the linguistic vocabulary in a very, what Derrida would call, hauntological sense, the haunted ontology, that which is gone but not quite, right? And again, even if you look at the architecture of our country and how that gets represented in literature, there are these forgotten monuments, the lost buildings. So, for instance, we made a trip to a place called Murshidabad in India, very close to West Bengal, where the Battle of Plassey was fought. And of course, there is a tomb of Siraj-Dowlah and everything else. But also there are these forgotten monuments waiting to be broken and taken over as apartment buildings or whatever, right? So that liminal site, which is waiting to be fully forgotten, but hasn't been forgotten completely. And this is where thing theory comes in, I think. And this is a really fertile field. So what I'm offering some ideas for research in future, looking at affect studies, memory studies, and thing theory. If you use theories like Bill Brown, for example, because the whole idea of thing theory is looking at thing as post-object, post-utility, post-purpose. And in a country like India, where utility is such a discursive function, where the whole idea of purpose is such a discursive function, where something serves a purpose and is discarded, right? The whole idea of the discarded subject or discarded object, the forgotten subject, becomes such a contentious category in India. And when it comes to monuments and buildings and museums and identities and language and so on and so forth, I think Indian writing in English can serve a very unique function, because here we have this massive data set in our country of things which are waiting to be fully forgotten, things which haven't been forgotten, things which are still haunting the cultural collective imagination, like the transistor, like the radio, like the half-broken building, like the abandoned project, right? And how that can enter the linguistic vocabulary, and does enter the linguistic vocabulary, even in terms of kitchenware, even in terms of looking at objects which don't serve any function anymore. Jhumpa Lahiri's fiction is full of such objects. So we find this very material density in Lahiri's fiction, the ontological density in Lahiri's fiction. We find that she packs her stories with so many objects, the kitchenware, the spoons, the utensils, all these things, the domestic architecture. But the whole purpose is she's giving you the objects which are also things, objects which are post-objects, which don't really serve any function apart from nostalgia. And then again, how the nostalgia connects to aspiration, connects to the future orientation. So I think I will end with this note. If you look at the triangulation of affect theory, memory studies, and thing theory, particularly in a country like India, where nostalgia can be weaponized, where aspiration can be weaponized, where the whole idea of materiality is such a contested category, I think that really opens up some really rich research in this particular domain. And I'm completely endorsing what Professor Paul and Professor Saha was saying in terms of looking at the unique linguistic register of Indian writing in English, and even a very semantic study of that, how the language has changed, can give us a sense of what gets forgotten but not quite, that liminality about that language, which I think can give us some fantastic ideas for research in future. So with that, I end, and I thank the Sahitya Akademi again for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Paroi. And I must speak a word about Sahitya Akademi's choice of this panel. Wonderful panel, and we are really having interesting issues that we can discuss further. In discussing Indian writing in English, we have fallen into a habit of repeating by rote lots of things that we have been saying for the past 50 years or so. Professor Paroi and Ajanta ji, and after that, Amit, they have broken grounds which really need consideration, but we come to this later. We have right now a poet and an academic and a critic and whatnot, wonderful translator as well, Sri Lata. And I understand that when she speaks to us, she opens another fresh window for us to understand, to appreciate, and to read Indian writing in English. You are welcome, Professor Sri Lata. Please make your presentation now.
Thank you so much, Professor Rahman. And I hope I'm audible before yeah.
Very much.
Thank you. Many thanks to the Academy for this very kind invitation and for conceptualizing this brilliant panel on a subject that really needs to be talked of more, not just lip service, but really discussed at depth at some length. And I'm really indeed honored to be on the same panel as my illustrious colleagues, writers, scholars, and thinkers such as yourselves. I'm going to depart slightly from the very academic tone of the symposium, if that's all right, and speak a little bit as a practitioner and how I would approach this whole idea of multiculturalism, and not really approach, but it's really part of who all of us are, right? And in the context specifically of Indian writing in English. In an opinion piece that was published a while ago, earlier this year, for the New Indian Express, titled Politics of New Poetry and the Salesman Poet, the poet C.P. Surendran spoke of the explosion of poetry in present-day India. And he sort of was not very happy about it. And he spoke of the spurt in online publishing and poetry readings, in the publication of numerous anthologies that included rather than excluded. And he wondered if this was perhaps really a reflection of the dumbing down of poetry and so on, right? So it was a long argument. But of course, then I sort of wrote a counter to it. And I remember sort of making the argument. I think there is a disturbance. Yeah. Okay. So one is aware, of course, that there is a system of gatekeeping which operates a little bit insidiously when it comes to Indian writing in English. And this, of course, includes poetry. And as a poet, I'm, I think, quite aware of it also. And this system is really designed, I believe, to keep the richness of multiculturalism out, to keep perspectives, sort of from the margins out of mainstream literary canons. And one can talk of these margins in more ways than one. I mean, and I'm not just talking about the usual categories when we think of margins, right? So, for instance, this could look like keeping writers or poets with the wrong sorts of accents out of the literary space. The tragedy is, of course, that we will never really know what we have lost, but we'll never get around to reading those writers. They will never get published. And so we really need to, I think there is an argument to be made for democratizing the space. So that is one thing, to include rather than exclude at this point in the arc of Indian writing in English, I think. And also we need to understand from the inside as writers, as scholars and thinkers, what does it really mean to inhabit a multicultural universe, a multilingual, plural, multicultural universe such as India? And how does it inform our own practice as writers and as thinkers, right? And I'm not talking about just what does it mean in the context of bhasha literatures or vernacular writing. That's of course, I mean, that's just a fantastic space out there, and really worthy of being looked at. But I think even in the context of Indian writers writing in English, I think we need to think about it. And as I said, really think about it in terms of how does it constitute our own selves from the inside as writers inhabiting this world. So what does this mean to be an Indian writer writing in English, or even just a student of literature in India, a person for whom books, the written word, and I'm using the phrase written word as an umbrella term for words in more than one language. What does it mean to be this person for whom the written word is central to your existence? What does it mean for them to inhabit this difficult, increasingly challenging world and all its complexities, its materialities? What does a creative life look like for an Indian writer who chooses to write in English in a society that is multilingual, multicultural, what Abhishek just called a rich data set? I mean, he spoke of it from another context, but he described it as, I think, a density of culture, right? And so I think, so what would your language then begin to look like as a poet, as a writer, when you're drawing on so many rich inputs, right? So I think this is a question which maybe confronted me quite early in life, but I wasn't really aware of it consciously. And I think it confronts many other writers writing in India who choose to write in English even, right? And each of us finds our own way to navigate the situation, which may seem confusing, sometimes a little annoying, because you want to sometimes brush aside parts of yourself that don't seem very English. I think we all go through a phase like that, but it's actually a very, very enriching universe. And that is something I think I've come to understand, right? So as an Indian writer, you do inhabit this world all the time, even though you may be perfectly alone in a room writing, and you may surround yourself with books that are only in English, but there's no escaping it. And there shouldn't, you shouldn't want to escape it really, right? So that world, that very rich, multicultural, multilingual world seeps into everything. And it's made visible by words. And these words that you all use as writers or as thinkers located in this society have social, historical lives and trajectories, right? So what does it take to then make material out of all of this rich cauldron, right? So this is a question I'm just hoping to raise. I may not have the answers for it because I was trained as an academic and I just set questions and I get others to give me the answers. So I'm just going to sort of turn this into a little bit of a personal account. So I grew up in India of the 1970s. And as a daughter of a single mother, my grandparents who lived with us almost until their passing, and my mother made up my family. And my forays into writing and eventually also into translation are very clearly connected to this linguistic journey through a multicultural context, quite typical perhaps of those of us who grew up in India, right? So I grew up in Kanpur in Uttar Pradesh, and later we moved to Chennai. I studied in Hyderabad for a brief while. Then I moved to the US for a very brief while. So we spoke Tamil and some English at home, and my second language at school, I went to one of the Kendriya Vidyalayas, was actually Hindi. So like most Indian children, and like all of you here, I'm sure in this on this panel, I grew up listening to and absorbing a medley of languages. Almost the first thing I realized when I started to write in English is that you're never going to be able to get to where you want to get to as a writer if you're hung up on writing solely from that place we call English, right? Even though I was a student of English literature, apparently, right? Because the thing is, you don't fully belong to it and you don't have to, right? And because of where you're living, where you're raised, the sounds and the languages and the people in your life. So to sort of tell yourself that you can or that you should only write in English and that English only means that particular type of English you hear in the drawing rooms of people with certain kinds of cultural capital is to set yourself up for failure as a poet, right? Am I still audible? I was wondering if I lost, I'm okay. So, okay.
Audible, very much audible.
Yeah, because there's some glitch in the power, that's why. So to write from the whole of yourself, from a linguistic literary heart space that is made up of so much that is rich and diverse and deserves to be heard, read, and written, so much more than just English will permit is important. So why deny yourself and others that pleasure and that richness? So yes, I do write in English, but I also write from more than that. I write partly from Tamil, partly from Hindi, and partly from English. Right. So now, with the permission of the chair and others on this panel, I thought I would read just 2 or 3 short poems, which really demonstrate what I'm trying to do with language.
Please do.
Yeah. So this one poem is called "Because I Never Learned the Tree Names of Tamil." Because I never learned the names of trees in Tamil. It's from my collection, The Unmistakable Presence of Absent Humans. Because I never learned the names of trees in Tamil. You pour it into my ears, the warm oil of tree names in Tamil, and not one of them in soft, cool italics. You're looking, I know, to oust that commonish insect, frantically alive, trapped there since class 1. Manjanadi, you say, and Murungai, Alamaram, roots you can swing on, girl, airy wings of Tatapuchi that will tangle with your hair. In my support, I cite the carefree impunity of lovers who carve their names on trees they don't know the names of. Palamaram, you say, not giving up. Poovarasamaram, Vepamaram, Maguramaram. The insect stops beating its wings, learns to luxuriate in this unfamiliar oil, acquires a certain sparkle. It's something else entirely that flies out my ear. So this is one in which I've sort of, the names, the Tamil names just are embedded there. And this is another poem which is called Guten, because as I said, I also learned, Hindi and, the words never leave my mind. All these words never, in these different languages, never leave my mind when I'm apparently writing in English. So this poem is called Guten, Suffocation, which I wrote during the pandemic. This was published in the Sahitya Akademi anthology, 3 Women in a Single Room House. Guten. I feel a certain Guten, Amma said, using a Hindi word I have almost forgotten, but know in my bones, in my skin. Here in the voices of friends I've been calling in turns, one of whom tells me she can't breathe. It is Guten I see in the eyes of the young who walk the empty streets. It is Guten in the playgrounds without a childhood, in a childhood without playgrounds. It is Guten in the souls of old women who stay home and stay home and stay home, dreaming of mangoes. This season, I'm told, even the mango trees are heavy with Guten. And I'll sort of just maybe this will be the last poem I'll read. It's sort of partly, I think, well, meant to be humorous, but obviously also has a darker undertone to it. And it's really about the mixing of languages in India. And again, this is a poem that came from the pandemic. It's based on a real, on something that really happened on a real incident. My Mr. Swami, tourist guide, Mahabalipuram. He looks about 50, but you couldn't be sure. With the mask, there is no saying. Madam from Tamil Nadu, he asks hopefully. I nod. Not my husband, though, he isn't. A sigh escapes his lips. Then, we'll speak English, madam. I'm born Trichy. I want to turn the clock back. I want to hear him speak Tamil mellifluously, like they do in Trichy, but it is too late. We are committed to this broken bridge of a language. I am Mr. Swami, he says. I will tell you everything. All Mahabalipuram history, need not to worry. 5 minutes into this, one of us has a question. Mr. Swami smiles. Listen and then, in the end only, questions, please. At the Shore Temple, he insists on taking pictures of the four of us. My daughter, earphones on, half listening to her online lecture. My son, nervous about posing with his mask off. But COVID's not gone yet, he says. We agree with Mr. Swami that the Pallavas are brilliant. Privately, we whisper, how unfair that the credit always goes to the kings. You see two Ganeshas at entrance stop? You know Ganesha? Ganesha is in Hindi language. In Tamil, Pillayar, elephant god. Ganesha, North Indian god in the beginning. Pallava king first to make Ganesha sculpture and include here. But Ganesha is sitting outside the temple only, not inside. In the north, Ganesha having two wives, Riddhi and Siddhi. In the south, he is bachelor. In the south, Kartikeya, Muruga is having two wives, Valli and Devayana. In the north, he is bachelor. All confusion only. Who is bachelor? Who is having wives? We should ask gods only. It's likely a story he tells stories over and over, but it cracks us up. We laughed for the first time that afternoon. English, Tamil, and Hindi very nearly forgetting themselves, meeting halfway on that broken bridge. Thank you. I think I've exceeded my time.
Have you finished with that? Have you finished? Yes.
Yes.
Friends, before we get set for the next session, which is at 12:30, 5 minutes are left for that. Just a few concluding remarks. To put it very briefly, it was a very thought-provoking session, as I should like to put it. Issues that we have often thought about have been very clearly laid out today in the times that we had, each one of us around 12 minutes or so. And thanks each one for keeping to the time that we had, because in seminars and symposia, we're often say in a way threatened by that tingle and by the time, therefore we can't exceed that. But lots of issues have come forward. I understand personally that ever since one started taking interest in reading and writing on Indian writing in English, that is how I started. And when I started in the late 70s, everyone was telling me, ye kya kar rahe hain bhai aap? Indian writing in English, can they do and can they write, etc., etc. But we have moved far, far away from that, and we have reached a place where now we are discussing about what is this form of the car writing that we are into, and developing that form of writing, and what is the language that we are trying to use. My understanding, I would like to submit to my fellow panelists here, that there is one kind of writing in English that we have, and there is another kind of writing in English that those who come from the English-speaking worlds do have. I understand our language is getting thicker and thicker, more important day by day and day after day. Take, for example, the cases starting from Professor Paru, you made mention of to Rajmohan Smile, if I start from there and come to R.K. Narayan. But there are three very important stages I personally look at. The kind of language that R.K. Narayan gave us. And in the preface to Kantapura, what Rajarao says, everyone quotes about that. What Kamala Das says, everyone quotes about that. But I take three very important examples. One is R.K. Narayan's kind of language, which has wit as its prime and the hallmark of it. The kind of language that is constructed through wit, which is a very special thing to have. And after that, you come to G.P. Tisani, All About H. Hatter, and you refer to Professor Paru, you refer to that. Very interesting novel as far as the question of language is concerned, how language is evolving. And after that, the language that Rushdie brought to us in Dead Children. So these are the three hallmarks, that is how language develops. In between, we have lots of variations. For example, you have Golden Gate by Vikram Seth, an entirely different kind of a fiction and different kind of language that he was trying to write there. That was verse. In between, we have had lots of fiction that has come to us. And if you go back to poetry, you also have the same kind of a paraphernalia that takes place. For example, you start with Fakir of Jangira by De Rosio. And then you come to Sarojini Naidu, which is a far cry from that. And then you come to another set of poets starting from Nissim Ezekiel and G. Patel and Daruwala. Now, the very interesting point is that every post-colonial site, wherever you go, in all the post-colonial sites, all the poets who started writing under the shadow of the Romantics. And our poets also did the same, like Sarojini Naidu. But when we take a jump from there, we come to Ezekiel, you come to Daruwala, and you come to other poets who made wonderful experiments not only with their language, but also with the form itself. My understanding is that in our language, there is another language that is all the time echoed. For example, when I speak, maybe you can find some kind of echoes of my Urdu in that. But also, when I read, especially Aga Shahid Ali, I could sense that well, someone else is speaking through the English language that Aga was trying to write in. And when I translate, and I translate essentially poetry, and my latest book, which is this week, it has come out, translations of Ghalib and commentaries on 200 books. I often thought, what was I doing with my language here in translating Ghalib? Was I writing an English language in which an English poem is written in our country? Or was I writing a different kind of an English in which I was trying to bring to my readers the Ghalib who wrote in the 18th, 19th century? So these are very interesting kinds of scenario that we have before us. The language that I speak at my home, my Urdu, my Hindi, the language in which I use or I write my translations, the language in which I write my own poems, either in the. So I personally find that in most of us that we write, and Shilata was wonderfully quoting those poems in which the echoes of her own language are present. Very interesting studies have also been made in which they have talked about how the linguistic interference is very much there. I won't call it interference, but linguistic kind of amezish isko aap kehte hain, which means that how you learn from there and how it echoes into your life. So the most important part of our language is the kind of echo that we have. Interesting examples have been given about that. Professor Paru spoke about affect and heteroglossia and multiculturalism and multilingualism, especially materiality and remembrance and forgetting. All these form parts of it. When it so happened as a teacher, I found that during the 80s, the scenario was changed from 90s onwards. From 70s to 80s, around 10 years or more, maybe a decade or more, the kind of PhD thesis that was being written and guided by our colleagues all over the country was very stereotypical, very, very stereotypical. But as far as the ways of looking and the methodologies of reading are concerned, situation changed entirely after 90s. So now we are engaging with more important issues, not only of the character and of the language and of the form of the novel, but going deeper into it, how the knowledge and how a story is being told to us in a language and in a manner which is entirely ours. And this also competes very well with the language in which others are writing in other English-speaking countries. So we are a very distinguishable kind of a lot, very, very distinguishing kind of a lot. So our writing in English and other writing in English in other spaces, there is wonderful idea and there is a wonderful way of looking at it and trying to develop some ideological issues as well when we look at this point. Experimentation has been very important for us. Lots of us have made experimentations as poets and as fiction writers. And some experimentations are only for the sake of experimentations, but others have also been very important experimentations. And there also I find both the form and the language has joined hands. Translation also has impacted, I understand, I may not be entirely right. But I understand translation also has impacted writing, original writing, creative writing in our own language, especially English. So when I write my English, my ghalib and my mir echoes there. And I find that it's coming somewhere or the other. I don't know how it enters, but it enters into my consciousness and shows through my poems that I write or translate. So that is another interesting. Critical reception is, of course, very important for us to think of right now as it is, because with the coming of theory, and because many of my colleagues say theory is for reading, not for applying. That's another question that we may not discuss here. But in the light of the theory, which is always at the background, with that, we can probably develop a new way of reading Indian writing in English, which has been so powerful, especially during the past 2 decades that we have had, ever since Rushdie and ever since others who have come into. Now, as far as poetry is concerned, Shilada made a very interesting point. I also spoke somewhere, I'm not very sure whether I was right, but I did speak, and I do repeat here, that many of us who are writing poems, it doesn't sound nice, but we are all talking about issues, let's say that also, I'm putting it once again, that you write a prose paragraph, break it into lines, and it looks like a poem. So is that really a poem? Does that work? Does it have a structure? Does it have a form? Does it have an imagery or a metaphor? Does the metaphor qualify into a symbol? Does the symbol qualify into a kind of a myth? So is that progression really taking place? Is that poem really a poem which you would like to pay some attention to? But to me, it appears that lots of us, but it shouldn't be really worrying us, in the sense that when Bilal put his anthology together, anthology and declared Indian poetry in English, and at that point of time, he also said, and everyone was saying, around 500 poets are writing today. Today, more than that are writing. But what we call in Persian, Ratbo Yabis, means that is not significant, will simply die down and fade out, will not stay on. So we shouldn't be much worried about what's being written all over, but something that comes out of it, a dozen voices, and all voices are not going to stay, but they are important markers in the sense that a tradition has been kept up now. So during the past decades, we have been talking about the emergence of a tradition. I understand a tradition has already emerged now. So a new kind of Indian historiography of writing in English has come up with new parameters, critical parameters that we need to look at, through which we need to look at. And now things are in a position when things are settling down. That is how we talk about our language and their language, our form and their form, and how finally a universal form, if at all there is a sense of a universal form or a language or authentic form or a language is there, which is another questionable issue. So the question of canon and of trugolosia and remembrance and forgetting all come into this framework, to which references have been made, especially by Professor Parvi and Amit and Shulata and Ajanta ji. So language issue is there. Use of technology is this has opened ways, which has been referred to, which has opened ways to look at Indian writing in English in any perspective entirely. We are at a very interesting point of time right now, at the beginning of the century. Very 20 years have already gone by, one quarter is over almost. Now we are at a very interesting point of time where technology is being used, and with this, I understand new ways of reading and new ways of developing perspectives on Indian writing in English will come forth. Use of technology is very important that way. Democratization of the space is also very important, which Shilta was talking about. Very clear democratization of language. Because not only that, we speak different languages, we also come from different cultural backgrounds. And therefore, in our language, in our form, that form takes place. So if you're writing a rubai, for example, or a kata, for example, in 4 lines, or if a sonnet you are writing, given a certain kind of a framework, or other forms in which you have 3 lines poem or a 4-line poem, and you have full stanza of 7 lines, 8 lines. In Urdu and Persian, there are very clearly categorized things that you write a poem of 6 lines or 8 lines or 7 lines, and there are different names. Similarly, in English, you have all these experimentations being made. So the form is under evolution, I understand. The language is under evolution, I understand. So these important issues of the Bhasha literatures also, as far as when you think of translation and think of original writing in English, Bhasha literatures and original writing English. So our scenario is packed with issues that really intermix with each other. How languages are echoing each other, how forms are echoing each other or reflecting each other, and how the very consciousness that we have, how it's being intermixed and how a final form is coming out, if at all there is anything that we can call final. So experimentation, I understand, is the most important issue that we are engaging with in different ways, and the manners of reading are also undergoing great transformation. So the question of language, question of writing, critical reception, and say you talk of the influence and that anxiety of influence. For example, when they were writing around 70s or 80s, there was so much of anxiety of influence. I understand that very anxiety has now gone forth in a big way. One has come to a stand, one has come to write with certain amount of confidence. Academies, the seminars and the publications, they are all there. They are creating a condition, they are creating an atmosphere. So there is an atmosphere now which is created by those who are writing and those who are trying to read these writings. It's a very interesting phase that we are in, and that is how I understand Indian writing English has to be looked at. And there is a great future about Indian writing English, coming from a variety of places, linguistic and cultural background, and heteroglossia and forgetting and etc. that we talked about, and then and the reading methodologies that we have in hand today. I should not like to take more time because there is another session in waiting. Mr. Kumbahone, thanks for this putting together this session, a wonderful panel in place so that we could talk and discuss our issues that we have had in our minds for some time now. So this has been a time for us to share our thoughts. Wonderful speakers, thank you so much, and wish you all the very best for the day and ever after. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Mr. Kumbahone, I will stay on.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, dear sir. I formally thank the chair, Professor Anisur Rahmanji, and the speakers in this session, Ajanta Paulji, Amit Shankar Sahaji, Abhishekji, and K. Srilataji, for discussing and raising so many significant issues in connection with Indian writing in English. Thanks a lot. This session ends here, and we will immediately begin the next one, which will be chaired by Shormistha Panjaji, and the speakers will be Anita Singhji, Gopal Lahidiji, Jaideep Shadangiji, and A.K. Nalinaji. I will formally introduce all the participants and the chair as well first, and then will request the chair to conduct the session. The chair of this session, Professor Shormistha Panjaji, is former professor, Department of English, University of Delhi. She received her PhD from Brown University. She has authored, edited, co-edited multiple books on Shakespeare studies, gender, and visual culture. Her most recent book is Performing Shakespeare in India, Exploring Indianness, Literatures, and Cultures, revised edition, Bloomsbury, 2024. And our speakers are Dr. Anita Singhji. Anita Singhji is professor and head of the Department of English at Banaras Hindu University. She received Fulbright Nehru Visiting Scholars Fellowship for the year 2013 and 14 at the University of Virginia, United States of America. She was a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla from 2018 to 2020. Her recent publications are Staging Feminisms, Gender, Violence, and Performance, and the two edited volumes, Gender, Space, and Resistance, Women and Theatre in India, and Hero and Hero Worship, Fandom in Modern India. She is a president of the Asian African Association of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Dr. Gopal Lahidiji is a bilingual poet, critic, editor, writer, and translator with 31 published books, including 8 solo or jointly edited books. His poetry and prose are published across more than 100 journals and anthologies globally. His poems are translated in 18 languages and published in 14 countries. He has been nominated for Pushkar Prize for Poetry in 2021. He has been conferred first Jayant Mahapatra National Award 2024 for his significant contribution to Indian writing in English. Dubbed as Bard on the Banks of Dulung, Dr. Jaideep Shadangi is an Indian poet, poetry activist with 11 poetry collections in English, latest being The Half Confession, and scholar on Dalit studies, post-colonial studies, and Indian writings with 41 books anchored in Kolkata, Jhargram. Widely anthologized and reviewed as a significant contemporary poet, Sharangi is on the editorial boards of journals of repute devoted to marginal studies and poetry criticism. With R.O.B. Harl, he has edited 6 anthologies of poems from Australia and India, which are a wealthy literary link between the nations. Dr. A.K. Nalinaji is our next speaker, an experienced academic with 18 years of in teaching English, currently serving as assistant professor at Sri Krishna Arts and Science College, former head of the Department of English at Rathinam College of Arts and Science, holds a PhD in English language teaching from Anna University, specializing in ESL teaching methodologies and reading strategies. Authored articles in national and international journals, actively involved in organizing academic events, including national symposia and workshops. I heartily welcome all the speakers and the chair and request Dr. Sharmishta ji to please open the session. Hello, Sharmishta ji.
Yes.
You're audible now. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So thank you, Krishna ji, for introducing all the speakers in this session. Thank you, Sahitya Akademi, for inviting me to chair this session in about recent trends in Indian English writing. Now, I have been told that each speaker will get about 10 minutes each.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think we can move on to the first speaker. And then at the end, I will just say a few words after we have heard each of the speakers.
Fine.
So if we could please hear the first speaker.
Yeah, our first speaker is Professor Anita Singh ji.
Thank you so much.
Hearty welcome, Anita ji.
Yeah, thank you so much. Am I audible? Okay, thank you so much. So I thank Sahitya Akademi for giving me this opportunity, and I also thank the previous session, which was very interesting, although I was not there full time. I thank Professor Anisur Rahman also for summing the entire session so well. So I will begin with my presentation. So the topic that was given to us was multiculturalism and Indian writing in English. So I will very briefly begin with what I understand by these two concepts. So I'll begin with some theoretical musing to form a background of what I intend to speak today. So the very concept of multiculturalism stemmed from the changes that were taking place in after World War II, and what Susan Wessendorf in her 2013 edited book calls the multiculturalism. She calls it the human rights revolution, in which the horrors of institutionalized racism and ethnic cleansing became almost impossible to ignore in the wake of the Holocaust. Multiculturalism then further became very popular as a political theory in 1970s and 80s, when it was used to denote a shift in the public policy away from the assimilation and ethnic minorities and immigrants towards integration and acceptance of diverse cultures. And as was mentioned in the earlier session, also India has always been, since time immemorial, been multicultural, although we did not this term did not have that kind of currency. We were multilingual, very much multilingual, with various invasions that were happening with time. Although we have always been critiqued for having a very entrenched caste system, which is a kind of a social hierarchy. But our larger aspiration or philosophy has always been towards Vasudev Kutumbaka, a Sanskrit phrase which clearly means the world is a family. It is a philosophy that emphasizes the collective well-being of all people over individuals. The phrase, as we know, is found in the Maha Upanishad. Currently, in political philosophy, multiculturalism focuses on how societies either respond to or should respond to cultural and religious diversity. It is often linked to concepts like identity politics, the politics of difference, the politics of recognition. The concept also intersects with economic interest and political power dynamics. In India, as we have seen in recent years, the scope of political multiculturalism has expanded to address the needs of various disadvantaged groups, such as writings from Northeast, tribal, indigenous writing, women, Dalit, and the LGBT community as well. Tariq Madood also in his book Multiculturalism very clearly says that we need multiculturalism very importantly because it is a form of integration. Bhikkhu Pathak, on the other hand, rethinking multiculturalism counters the tendency to equate multiculturalism with racial minorities, and he says that multiculturalism is in fact not about minorities, but it is a proper term in terms of relationship between different cultural communities, which means that the standards by which communities resolve their difference and principles of justice must come not only from one of the cultures, but must be open and equal and have an equal dialogue between them. Susan Moller Oken, who's a feminist philosopher and political philosopher, has argued in 1999 book, Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women? That the principle that all cultures are equal means that all rights of women in particular are sometimes severely violated. And in India, as we know, we are currently debating about having a uniform civil code, whether to have a uniform civil code or not to have a uniform civil code. And we have arguments for and against that. Further, the Indian scenario in the context of multiculturalism presents a typical case where caste, religion, class intersect to complicate the perspective of multiculturalism. If we come to multiculturalism in literature, is an idea that culture is an integral part of a story and that literature embraces many cultures. And the approach can transform books into cultural documents and are used for sociological research as well. In the previous section, Professor Anisur Rahman did mention about the methodologies. What methodologies do we envisage or do we think of when thinking about Indian writing in English? I will here take the model that Sujit Mukherjee talks about for the need to develop a new methodology to write Indian literary history that takes into account multiple languages, Indian languages, of course, their literary traditions and their mutual influence to one another. 3 particular books that I would like to mention here is Towards a Literary History of India, Some Positions on a Literary History of India, and The Idea of an Indian Literature. As we know, Sujit Mukherjee was a well-known translator and an editor at the Orient Longman, where he served as the chief publisher. He's also known for his translations of Gora and Tagore's Gora and Buddhadev's The Book of Yudhishthir. And if you look at Meenakshi Mukherjee's Realism and Reality, it follows a similar kind of methodology that I can see. And the rationale behind formulating a new methodology is founded on the fact that India has multiple language, multiple literary traditions where it cannot be successfully represented by one history and one literature. Rushdie's claim that Indian writing in English is the best or it is something that is phenomenal and should be taken into account has been discounted by most of us very vehemently, if not very critically. So that is why we need to appropriate a critical approach that would reflect the unity in diversity and diversity in unity, very characteristics of Indian literary tradition. Now here, very briefly to illustrate what I'm trying to suggest, is I have taken 4 writings from very diverse writings, all from the early 21st century that reflect different roots and experiences that emerge from this. And they're all about gender fluidity, gender concerns that are arising out of what is happening in the larger socio-political reality, like the transgender protection right that we've seen, the scrapping of the Article 377, decriminalizing homosexuality and so on, and also the larger concern after Nirbhaya, the safety of the women, the public spaces, and so on. So all these 4 texts very importantly reflect these concerns. And as I said, they're drawn from different languages, different regions, and so on. The first text that I would take up is a ethnographic work. It is a research. It is a non-fictional work that is Shilpa Phadke's, etc. There are other contributors also, which says Why Loiter, Women and Risk on Mumbai Streets. So as I said, that this is a kind of a ethnographic work. It is a research based on how safe women are in the cosmopolitan cities. So the larger concern is that the writers express on the basis of the research are that the cities' infrastructures are also very patriarchal, and women's safety needs to be ensured. And a very interesting fact that the book, professes is that loitering should be a feminist ideal. So women are told to go out in public spaces, get the work done, and get back. So loitering is something that is a masculine, right, privilege, and so on. So it has a whole lot of one would say ideas about how public spaces could be more turned into more egalitarian and safe spaces for women. The next book that I take up is Nalini Jamila's Autobiography of a Sex Worker, which was translated by J. Devki. It is originally written in Malayalam. And as the book suggests, it's an autobiography of a sex worker. So when this book was published, it received a lot of backlash that how can one read an autobiography of a sex worker and consider it to be literature and so on. So I guess my time, I have another 5 minutes more or 2-3 minutes more. Professor Panja, if you can just tell me.
Yeah, you can.
Okay, I'll continue. Okay. The third book that I take up is Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi, Red Lipstick or Me Lakshmi Me Hijra. It's a transgender narrative. And of course, she talks about her gender fluidity and how she is not accepted by the society, the kind of difficulties that she faces. But at the end of it, she writes, my life is a celebration. So despite all this, she asserts her identity and she says that my life is a kind of a celebration. The last I would take up is Baby Kamle's The Prison We Broke. It was translated by Maya Pandit and originally written in Marathi, I suppose. I may be wrong. And here also, as
yes, it is in Marathi.
Marathi, right. It's written in Marathi. So here also, Baby Kamle talks about how she grew up and how she had to face a kind of a caste and patriarchal biases that she had to face, the discrimination that she faced. And despite that, she is a very close observer of society. And this autobiography turns out more into a testimony. And it's her life is very closely connected to the community where she lives and interacts with. And she too finds her kind of affirmation in this society. So all the four narratives or all the four works that I have picked up, they talk about the kind of experiences of marginalization or experiences of, being a particular kind of a person. But despite that, there is a kind of affirmation that all these narratives, so Baby Kamle also at the end of the novel, of her autobiography, she says that she found her relief in Ambedkar's speech and Ambedkar's writing, and this is where she gathers her strength for. So all these voices that I just presented before you were individual voices. There were experiences of diverse constructions of gendered bodies across caste, classes, regions, religion, language, and other categories. So as a cultural text, they create liminal spaces where reimagination of cultural and political praxis can result in the growth of inclusive politics put forth by engagements with issues like visibility and invisibility, hegemony and marginalization, articulation and silence. As literary and cultural performance, these texts from very different contexts have created or can create or do create a kind of a discourse which challenge existing literary structures on the one hand. As I said, Nalini Jamila's autobiography of sex worker, existing literary, they challenge the entire canon of literary structures through the articulation of caste, sex, and work discrimination. So I'll close with that. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Anita ji.
Thank you.
If with the approval of the chair, I invite Dr. Gopal Lahiri ji to speak.
Thank you, Krishna ji. And I'm audible.
Yeah, you
understand. Yeah. Thank you, Sahitya Akademi, for inviting me for today's symposium. I will be talking about issues and emerging trends in prose writing mainly, especially fiction, in Indian writing in English. But the issues are very similar in poetry and non-fiction as well. Fiction, often offers you a window into the minds of some of the most important contemporary Indian writers who write in English. Some of them delve into the intractable problems our society is grappling now, while others offer the historical, mythological, ecological context in their writings. And there is the science fiction writers as well, across a spectrum of form and style, and especially the advent of artificial intelligence that will probably change the science fiction writing as well. And my previous speakers has already mentioned that multiculturalism is the default in India, and which is very true because we know that there are so many languages which are spoken in India. And literature has the power to change the way we think, to challenge our assumption, and to inspire us to be a better version of ourselves. And literature is always a bridge between cultures and between generations. And we believe literature is a journey, not a destination. While reading, we try to understand where we are going, and what it all means. In these moments of unsettling, we see people talk, hide, and move on to this world. In this century, sometimes we feel a sense of missing, but each fiction unwinds its own place. Each story writes itself when the narrator begins to the last stop. Evaluation of language is one of the important part in this Indian writing in English. Some of the features which we noticed in modern writings are mentioned here because topicality of the issues are important. And some features of the modern writing of Indian writers who are writing in English is disturbs and unsettle as yet at time ask us to pause and ponder and interpret. And voice of the marginalized, and no dream fog as such, appealing in richness and sharpness of perception. Clarity of complicated psychological unpicking and stylish forms. I'm talking about the prose mainly. Monologues of impoverished world provide unexpected insight into mundane conflicts, and their after effects create a source of inadequate and disruption in life, clarity and candidness, the sweat and tears, and feel the desolation and misery. Some of the emerging trends which I follow, the issues are feminist writing, Dalit literature, changing ecosystem, cross-cultural impact, post-colonial writing and global concern, historical and science fiction, experimental technique, and now the marketing part also comes. So I start with feminist writing. In this century, women are more educated because of more opportunities are there, and women writers are writing about social injustice to women and question traditional roles of women in patriarchal society. Their writings, be it prose or poetry, serve as a powerful medium to amplify their voices and ideas. They feel issues like gender inequality, discrimination, and women's rights, where authors can influence public opinion and encourage action towards a more equitable society. Some of these novels are an act of resistance, an act of defiance, and express in a greater trajectory of openness. And the social commentary flows in memory, in history, in identity, grief, gender issues, consumerism, capitalism, and personal reflection. One or two examples which I can give right now, where just like quoting T.S. Eliot, that where blood turns into ink. If you map the creative journey of Geeta Hariharan, The Thousand Faces of Night, the first novel, and to the latest, I Have Become the Tide, you can find her questioning the code of patriarchy and brings to light the survival strategies of three generations of women. And she makes concerted use of myth and folklore to enlarge the space of the lives of real people, especially women. And while Meena Kandasamy writes on issues of caste and gender and how society puts these people into a very stereotypical roles. As a writer, Meena's focus was mainly on caste removal, feminism, and linguistic identity. In her latest novel, Exquisite Cadaver, she questions by making the margins a space of defiance and the reclamation of authoritarian prerogative. So more recently, one of the books I have read, I have had Enough of You by Soma Bose, which also outlines that that highlights the imbalances in the society with respect to women. So these are, this feministic writing are very, very commonplace now, especially this century, maybe last 25, 30 years, compared to the earlier ones in the mid 40s, 50s, because now that awareness is coming, even though slowly, but it is coming, and that's why these emerging trend is very much noticeable. And we must mention, of course, in the last century that about the name of Mahashweta Devi, who set the trends in her writing in post-colonial milieu. She talked about poor people from colonial times to post-modern. Her stories and fiction, like Draupadi, The Rights of the Forest, illustrate the devastation of natural habitats and erosion of ecological wisdom. So now I'm coming to Dalit literature, which also has become very prominent in this century, maybe last 20, 25 years, because another issue is Dalit literature, which focuses on the life of Dalit community who have usually been considered the lowest among the Indian population. Like Om Prakash Valmiki and Bama, they are writing autobiographical work, which is very important, that blur the line between fact and fiction, and they are talking about their own life. And what is happening that those written maybe a long time back, but this translation in English are coming right now, and that reach the global readers, and which actually makes a trend that more and more translation works are coming on various aspects of writers writing in many different Indian language, but they are now translated into English, and they become a part of Indian writing in English. And there are a few others, of course, with Jeet Thail has translated a few of the Babu Rao Bagul and few others who had translated recently of the Dalit community, writings of Dalit community, where they can understand that these issues are very, very important to tell our readers about how their lives are. And third important part with the Indian writing in English, the trend is changing ecosystem. You know, environmental issues and climate changes are growingly reflected in in fiction, in stories, and in poetry in Indian writing in English. The authors feel that the battle to write the balance of our art is real, and this is required to avoid the future catastrophe. While constructing this narrative, they have to rely on powerful stories to motivate social changes. The effect of climate change and environment now, it's a worldwide phenomena. The studies regarding the symbiosis between culture, creature, and environment are important. So is the literary realism, an imbalance and indifferent in the society. We have heard about Anthropocene, which marks the human influence on nature, and the consequences need to be assessed. Industrial is a key issue in destroying the environment, but environmental writers present facts through their narratives about, although sometimes subtly, but place them ultimately on a larger framework. This work requires the interconnectivity between the organism and the realize the importance of sustainability of environment, which is very, very important. The contemporary authors deftly write these ecological imbalances experienced by the inhabitants. And now we have heard about the ecofeminism, which is also a socio-environmental movement that underscored the degradation of women along with the destruction of environment. We have already, we know about Arundhati Roy's this book, The God of Small Things, where this narrative unfolds the story of three generations, and also the bio-regional concern of that place IMNM, and in Amitabh Ghosh Sundarban's Hungry Tides, where Sundarbans is the locale where her novel actually built on. And both these novels, they are the issue is that they are countering the people, the threats from the outside developments like modernization and industrialization. Hungry Tide, especially where there's categorized as a climate fiction, because climate changes is now the very much hot topic everywhere. And Amitabh Ghosh, this particular novel has, and again, another novel is there. There's a Ghana Island where both these intricately unite history, myths, and legends to produce a story about these restless tides of dislocation and exodus in the face of unrelenting climate changes, and few others. But these changes are, these novels on environment are quite different. If you look back to, say, last century, where in Bengali, you have heard Vibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay's one of the novel on Ichamoti, Restless Waters of the Ichamoti, where he celebrates the natural world of Bengal. The style and contents of those novels to nowadays these ecological novels are very, very different. In all its quietude, the novel considered the intersection of nature's vestiges of human habitation along with the issues which are coming up now. And with this another important part is this post-colonial writing and global concern, which actually we are seeing that there are so many Indian writers who are writing in English. They are their concern is not only an Indian concern but also global, because many of them have migrated to outside India, to US, UK, and they also bring in their novels the cultural trends and text of not only from India but also from the other places where they reside. In this way, I can mention the novel that White Tiger by Arvind Adiga provides a very darkly humorous perspective of India's class struggle in a globalized world, as told through a retrospective narration. From Balram Hawaii, he's a very village boy, but you see there are everything is there: the religion, caste, poverty, corruption, loyalty. It is both pertains to Indian culture and also to the Western culture, and that's very similar in Kiran Desai's novel Inheritance of Loss, where some characters snub those who embody the Indian way of life, others are angered by anglicized Indian. So you can see again this the backdrop of lives of several families in a post-independent India, delving into not only about the conflict, there is also the family, the social changes, the love, and many other aspects of their life. We have talked about Midnight Children by Salman Rushdie or A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth. These are they are the writers who are also concerned about this global concern. It's not only about the Indian cultures, but about global culture, and their experience actually enhance the writing of Indian writers in English. And what is important that they not only bring about this about the talking about the Indian culture, but they come to the concerns of outside India, what is happening there, and that aspect also enrich their literature. In Interpreter of Melodies, Jhumpa Lahiri also mentioned that this work, which observational detail where the yearnings of the exile, that is also important, that they are staying outside India, and these yearnings of exile and full of emotional pull and reverberation are noticed. And these are quite different from...
If I may interject, if you could now conclude, please.
Okay. Thank you. And just one or two points I must mention that there are other novels like a historical novel, where recently one story by on Awadh, I think, The Lion and Lily. This novel has come very recently by Ira Mukuti. That is also very, very interesting aspect of Indian history. And we know about that Shivaji's story on Mrityunjay. And another important thing which I couldn't mention about the mythological stories and the new interpretation, we know that modern writers and poets always deconstruct, demystify the mythological characters and raises many questions. So with these issues, I conclude that these are important issues, and modern writers who are writing in Indian English, they actually enhances their reach to all over the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lahiri. We'll go right on to the next speaker, that is Jaideep Sarangi. 10 minutes per speaker, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharmishtadi, and wonderful panelists and who are also authors. During this 10 minutes time, I will try to concentrate on certain aspects on current Indian poetry in English. Indian poetry in English is possibly currently going through one of its most visible and most vibrant phases. From being an unsure, questionable, and apologetic genre under colonial rule to evolving a distant idiom, identity, and niche for itself within global readership. Indian poetry in English today has effectively vernacularized the English language and subtly effectively has anglicized the country's bhashas through osmotic cultural diversity that we have been discussing throughout in this particular session, and linguistic plurality and the polyphony of imagination. The anxiety of Indianness, already been hinted at by Professor Anishul Rahman, as expressed by Meenakshi Mukherjee, is all over. The scope is huge and unbound. The democratization of English has blurred pocket centralism in English poetry in India. English poetry is a pan-Indian affair now, no more belongs to certain parts of India. Let me share with you a few of my takes from my side within the time frame I had today. First is India as the land of mythologies. And how do Indian writers are engaged to explore the Indian mythologies? If one or two pertinent issues that we want to capture from Indian writing in English in general, and to be specific in my talk today on Indian poetry, it is the explications or explorations of Indian myths through poetry. Recently, we have come across a book by Tamil poetess Lakshmi Kannan. The title of the book is Nadistuti. And Nadistuti is of the rivers and for the rivers flowing deep into our heart. Here the poet uses rivers of India as metaphors for women's lives and their bodies. That is the mastery that she makes. River changes from dry to full in seasons like a female body. And in the poem Nadistuti, actually, Lakshmi Kannan reminds us the American poet Langston Hughes, and the poem The Negro Speaks of Rivers. And in the Negro Speaks of Rivers, we know the river has grown deep into the self like the rivers. Deeply rooted in the Indian myths, Lakshmi describes the Indus River, referring to the significant deities residing near the river Indus, Parvati, Meenakshi, Rama, and all. Her poem Snake Omen explores the Indian cult of Naga Puja in order to please the snakes. Indian secret scriptures are replete with references to snakes and snake gods. The nocturnal experience is described in the poem as rich and extraordinary, with poetic embellishments and Indian imagination of female snake gods and some human snake forms. May I quote, "A red dot shining in its brow, mother watched fascinated yet fearful." Indian English poetry is at its best when it delves into the myths of the land and its people. Our poets are blessed to have numerous cultures, languages, and myths as their baggage. The second point that I would like to encompass today is the poetry of the mind. This is very difficult to handle poetry of the psychological parameters. Once one have the maturity of handling the idiom, one can handle the matters of the mind. A seasoned poet, Bibhu Padhi, and here Bibhu Padhi is with a poet of several poetry collections, But I will talk about only one poetry collection, A Friendship with Time. A Friendship with Time is not a poem, but it is a mental or psychological game that you play. He cannot rest until he translates whatever moves him into poems. For Padhi, anything that agitates, consoles, ignites, uplifts, electrifies, and liberates constitutes poetry. What a magic he holds. Here is a poet who enters into the home of thoughts unbidden without ringing the doorbell. Readers take a trip into the memory lane and relive the old moments again. Padi strives to bring to the surface what lies in his subconscious. History records what occurred, poetry what might be. That's why poetry has been defined as a divine ecstasy, and Bibhupati is a perfect example to that. To spin thought's wing waiting is a kind of suspended animation. It is a stock currency of life. We wait for the rains before we can plow. Poet Padi universalizes the state of waiting. May I quote, an ordinary day. This is the time I wait for, thought out or throughout the year, for sleep, further sleep. We go further and quote, mid-July rain, I am enclosed by the superstition's safety of my home, and I wish I were out in the rains. This is possibly the time when poetry is a search for identity. Now, poetry is also a kind of platform where the writers are engaged in expressing their threats and their emancipations through the identity politics and identity dynamics of sociology. Poetry as a search for identity. Here I will just refer to only two poets. One is Rabin S. Angam, very famous poet based in Imphal based, writes in two languages, but Manipuri and English. And let me quote a poem from Rabin, a poem for mother. Pelem Epoki, mother who gave birth to me. To be a man, how I hated. Leaving home 10 years ago. Now these heels have grown on me. I turned out to be a small man with small dreams, living a small life. What a wonderful dynamics it is to write from the northeastern part of India. And let me give another reference to T.K. Disco, and who is a female poet, academic, writer, and educator. She advocates the revival of indigenous Naga textiles and women's narratives, and she explores all she has been associated with through the art of poetry. T.K. Disco's poems prick us where it hurts most, in the deep confines of experiences stocked into the storage until called silence. So elegant, and the poems really reflect the tempo of that society. The fourth point that I would like to take on today is poetry possibly is at its aesthetic best. It's very difficult to create the aesthetics out of poetry because in the cacophony of poets in the modern day, possibly everybody is a poet. But there, as Professor Anir Suraman already hinted, some will stay. But aesthetically, how wise are the poets? Now it's time of Indian English poets to be very confident, and they are the soul makers for the world. Poetry as its aesthetic best. One perfect example of the recently published book by Bashudhara Roy, A Blur of a Woman. And the blur of a woman, we see Indian English poetry possibly at its zenith. There is no ailment, just the weather. Quoting from Dukkha. As we whisker from one page to another page of the collection, we get into the sunshine of the heart. It takes no time to get our bearings in full. Bashudhara writes and expresses feelings fiercely, tenderly, honestly, and contemplatively. Over these years, Vasudhara has evolved her own style of poetry writing, which is never loud and head-on. I'm quoting Beyond Morning. I'm not giving up this light. Look, I just seizured your quote. My lust truce with light. Her liberal feminism works within a liberal democracy to enact socialism through poetry that is not a manifesto or a slogan. Vasudhara is not confessional or half confessional like many of her contemporary poets, but she is a firm believer in the therapeutic power of the verse. Vasudhara is one of the rare poets for whom our eager ears wait, and writing is a magic, and Vasudhara is gifted with. Deroju to Vasudhara, I think Indian English poetry has long walked towards freedom, and Vasudhara creates a soul space, lifting us to know how she walks into poetry through failures and successes, through ghazal forms, which is a source of wisdom. The title of the collection smells political, but it has a description for itself. And like Pablo Neruda, the poetry of modern-day Indian English poets, I think, is the truth of the moment. To conclude, even though Indian poetry in English is going through its healthiest and the richest phase so far, it needs to be an able and discursive body of critical discourse to sustain seriously in the days to come. We know no literature can survive with proper value addition of the secondary source material that has been criticism and the body of criticism. It needs to be taught more enthusiastically in literature classrooms for its full potential to be explored and reaped. As I consider criticism as both art form and activism, I propose to critically engage with poetry as to offer it to good health and sustainability. I hope to see more works on Indian English poetry so that a solid platform can look into the parameters when Indian things will be discussed, dissected, bisected by the Indian scholars and references to Indian scholars. Thank you so much. Thank you. Over to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarangi, and particular note of appreciation for sticking exactly to your time limit. That was very considerate of you. Thank you. We now move on to the last speaker of this session, A.K. Nalina.
Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, you are. 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, all. Esteemed dignitaries, chair, fellow scholars, and love of literature people. It's both an honor and a privilege for me at this distinguished forum of the Sahitya Academy, a beacon of literary heritage and cultural variety of India. I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity to share my thoughts on a topic which I hope will resonate with the collective spirit of inquiry and appreciation that defines this gathering as well. Thank you so much. I'll just get into my topic. I have taken two prominent works, that is Ponnachi written by Perumal Murugan, and The House with 1,000 Stories by Aruni Kashyap, which has been a bridge between cultural identities in Indian literature. Ponnachi, or The Story of a Black Goat by Perumal Murugan, and The House with 1,000 Stories by Aruni Kashyap, dwells into the socio-cultural landscapes of India, albeit from the distinct regional and narrative perspectives. By examining their treatment of marginalized voices, cultural identities, and the interplay between tradition and modernity, this presentation serves a bridge between diverse Indian literary traditions while highlighting universal human experiences. I hope they have a commonality that they have written in English, but you will find two realms of two different places altogether, but the colorful umbrella of India. Here, Indian literature is a mosaic of diverse languages, cultures, and traditions. Works like Ponnachi and The House with 1,000 Stories exemplify rich narratives, traditions that emerge from regional context. yet resonate with universal themes. Ponnachi presents the life of a goat as an allegory for human struggles set in rural Tamil Nadu, while Kashyap's The House with the Thousand Stories captures the complexities of familial and societal relationships in Assam. This paper investigates how these two novels reflect and critique the socio-cultural realities on their respective settings, while also engaging with broader questions of identity and belonging. The first point I wanted to highlight, the similarities of these two works, cultural context and regional specificity. That is the first point that I need to highlight on. Murugan's Ponnachi is deeply rooted in Tamil rural life, offering a critique of societal norms, gender roles, and state control. The titular goat becomes a lens through which the author examines the vulnerability of marginalized beings, human and non-human beings alike. In contrast, Aruni Keshav's novel situates itself in the culturally rich but potentially fraught landscape of Assam, with a lot of unrest. Politically unrest situation. Through the lens of a wedding in a small Assami village, Kashyap explores themes of family, tradition, and impact of insurgency on everyday lives. Both novels emphasize the importance of regional specificity in their storytelling. Murugan's prose is steeped in the rhythm of rural Tamil Nadu, while Kashyap's narratives incorporates the oral traditional folklore and linguistic nuisance of Assam. These regional anchors not only enrich the narratives but also challenge the homogenization of Indian literature in the global literary market. So that is the beauty of these two works under the umbrella of India, the multicultural setup. The second point that I wanted to highlight is marginalized voices and subaltern narratives. A key commonality between the two works in their focus on marginalized voices. In Ponnachi, the goat symbolizes the plight of the voiceless and the oppressed, navigating a world defined by systematic inequalities. Murugan's choice to anthropomorphize a goat underscores the shared struggles of humans and animals in hierarchical society. Similarly, The House with a Thousand Stories gives voice to the marginalized communities of Assam, whose stories are often overshadowed by midstream narratives. Kashyap's portrayal of insurgency and its effects on ordinary lives brings a lot of attention to the subaltern experiences of a region grappling with identity and harmony. So this is the second point that I wanted to highlight here. The third one is tradition and modernity. Both novels grapple with the tension between tradition and modernity. In Ponnachi's traditional rural life, juxtaposed with the encroaching influence of bureaucratic systems symbolized by the mandatory registration of goat, which has been orphan goat, which has been adopted by old couple. So they will undergo a process of registering the small black goat. This tension highlights the erosion of traditional ways of life under modern state apparatus. In Kashyap's novel, the rituals and customs surrounding the wedding serves a microcosm of Assami culture, while the looming presence of insurgency and political unrest reflects the challenges of modernity. The interplay, the Prajwal is the main character, who is the young adult who deals with these two, tradition and the modern, in the novel. The interplay between these forces creates a noisome portrait of a society in transition. The last point that I want to highlight here is bringing cultural identities. While Ponnachi and The House with a Thousand Stories, they emerge from distinct cultural milieu. They share a commitment to bringing cultural identities through storytelling. By foregrounding regional narratives, both authors contribute to more inclusive understanding of Indian literature, one that celebrates diversity while acknowledging shared human experiences. So these two prominent works highlights these similarities under Indian writing in English. I wanted to highlight at the outset these two novels comes under a forum, the representation of varied portrayal of race, gender, sexuality, and disability contribute to a more inclusive literary landscape of Indian writing in India. Recognition of diverse perspectives and voices with a focus on amplifying minority narratives and experiences, which again which gives space for voice for the voiceless, and exploration of complex intersection identities, enhancing the richness of character representation. Furthermore, diverse critical frameworks such as feminist criticism and post-colonial studies have enriched literary analysis in the forum. The digital age has reshaped book reviews with online platforms, influencing readers' reception of literature in the present age, connecting with the present two authors, that is Aruni and Perumal Murugan. Literary works continue to impact music, film, and visual art, shaping contemporary cultural expression to create impact on popular culture. I think this is what I wanted to highlight in these two prominent work of the contemporary writers of Indian writing in English. I hope I have added something to this forum of multicultural studies in Indian writing in English review. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Over to the chair. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all the speakers in this session, Professor Singh, Professor Lahiri, Professor Sarangi, and Professor Balina. I think we've had a very enriching session, which really talks, if not overtly, then at least covertly, about emerging trends in contemporary Indian English writing, which was the theme of this session. And it's good that we have covered both poetry, fiction, and even non-fiction. Professor Singh mentioned non-fiction works as well. Now, I want to just hark back very briefly to Abhishek Parui's categories of affect, memory, and object. And I want to add something that Professor Lahiri also mentioned, the whole notion of the Anthropocene, which is the connection between humans and other creatures in the universe in a non-hierarchical way. And I think this is a very important emerging trend in contemporary Indian writing in English, which is helping contemporary authors overcome, a kind of dependence on the West, or a sort of Western way of looking at things. One of the most rich categories of literature that we have today in India is from the Northeast. And repeatedly, Northeastern authors are using indigenous myths and legends, talking about very local civilizations, and yet reaching out with a very powerful call for unity. Now, remember, it was unfashionable to talk in terms of universalism, say, even 10 years ago. But I think now, with the exploration of the local, we have now reached a point in time in Indian writing in English where we can actually talk about connections between people and not see this as the blinding homogenization of globalization. We are talking about the particular in all its authenticity, but through that very particular society, be it Dalit writings, be it writings about sexual minorities, be it writings from the Northeast, people are trying to reach out to other people. And I think that is particularly important in the age of strife, division, and difference that we live in. So I find this as enormously heartening. I think sessions as the ones that we have had today, bringing not just new writers to our focus, but also new scholars, young scholars. I think it's a wonderful enterprise that the Sahitya Akademi has undertaken. And I really want to stress this importance of communication and reaching out, not by dimming the particularity of the local, but by making it more resonant so that it echoes and reflects larger themes and larger issues that connect us all. And I think that notion that I said about non-hierarchization is crucial. You know, Abhishek mentioned things, materiality, the transistor. All right. Janice Parriott will talk about leaves on a plant in her book, Everything the Light Touches. Geeta Hariharan in I Become the Tide is talking about some verses of Dalit poetry, which he has excavated from the past. So the particularity of the material world, particular as it is, encourages a sort of, attitude towards human existence that includes objects, that includes the non-human, that talks about even the voices of plants that perhaps we can't all see, and makes us more attuned to the world around us, more compassionate and more open. Thank you.
Hearty thanks, Sharmishta ji. With this, the symposium ends. I, on behalf of Sahitya Akademi, thank Professor Anisur Rahman ji, Abhishek Paroi ji, and all the speakers, and the chairperson Sharmishta Panja ji also, for joining in for this wonderful symposium. I thank one and all on behalf of Sahitya Akademi. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.